All right, we will start broadcasting now. Let all our guests into the room. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris. I'm the events coordinator here. And tonight we are hosting a conversation between Rose Andersen and Brian Evenson. You can buy their books at powerhousebookstores.com. The links are in the event page, and I will also repost them in the chat. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and Rose and Brian can take your questions at the end of the event. I'll introduce Rose and Brian now. Rose Andersen received her MFA in writing at California Institute of the Arts, where she was awarded the Emmy Kiriyama Thesis Prize. Her essays have appeared in The Cut, Glamour, and elsewhere. She lives in Los Angeles with her spouse, Josh, and their dog, Charlotte. Brian Evenson is the author of more than a dozen books of fiction, most recently Song for the Unraveling of the World, which was the winner of the Shirley Jackson Award. He is the recipient of 3 O. Henry Prizes, an NEA Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He teaches at Cal Arts and lives in Los Angeles. I'll hand it over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and start. I am going to read a little bit for about 10 minutes or so, and then after that, I think Rose is going to read, and then we're going to have a conversation. So, and I'm going to read something really atypical that probably, if you know me at all, which most of you probably don't, you know me as someone who writes scary stories, and I'm actually going to read from this book, which is called Raymond Carver's What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, which is a book on that collection by Carver, but is also kind of a memoir. And I just thought, because we're gathered here for Rose and her new book, which is really terrific and fabulous, it might make sense to give a sense of memoir as well. So, okay. On the evening of July 4th of 2011, I started vomiting and found it impossible to stop. I was just back from 2 weeks of teaching a fiction writing workshop in Portugal, where I'd felt a little worse each day. At first, I thought I was just tired because of the time difference between Rhode Island and Europe. Then that I had a cold, then that maybe it was the flu. I slept more and more, felt increasingly disoriented. I was having trouble breathing, but I told myself this was just an indication that I was out of shape, that the more I walked, the better I'd feel. On the back of my story collection, Windeye, there's a picture of me standing in the Palace of Sintra, where if you look closely, you'll see my eyes are glassy, my face filmed with sweat. I'm smiling, but desperately so. I was trying to act like I was fine. I was, after all, the teacher. I was there to be the one who helped others, not the one who needed help. By the time I was convinced I needed a doctor, the workshop was almost over. Since I found daunting the idea of going to a doctor in a country where I didn't speak the language, I opted to stick it out and wait until I got home. But standing in the Lisbon airport early in the afternoon of Saturday, July 2nd, I realized that things were much worse than I had supposed. I couldn't stop sweating. I had no appetite. I felt increasingly disoriented, and I was suffering from pareidolia, beginning to experience auditory hallucinations. The last time I'd had pareidolia had been 3 or 4 years earlier, when I'd had the flu and had driven with my then girlfriend from Oklahoma to Rhode Island without adequate sleep, desperate to make it home to my own bed. Maybe it was flu after all, I thought, and then hoped the worst of the symptoms wouldn't strike until I'd landed. The SATA Airlines flight home seems to me now more of a hallucination than an actuality, in that disconnected and partial way that you, or at least I, remember things when you're very drunk indeed, as scattered bits and pieces with a kind of absence where you yourself normally reside. A few moments you can cling to, a great deal that's just lost and may come back later or not at all. I had not been drinking. I had had nothing to drink except water, and very little of that, and nothing to eat for some hours. It seemed a very long flight to me, and I have no memory of the 3-hour and 40-minute stop we took in the Azores at Ponta Delgada, despite some of the workshop participants on the same flight telling me later that I'd participated coherently in several conversations, that they'd had little sense that something was wrong with me. I do remember landing in Boston, exhausted, and my then girlfriend picking me up, and then the two of us driving home. I don't remember if she drove or I did. I suspect the latter, since I almost always did the driving, but I can't be sure. I believe I told her that I'd been feeling poorly, but as I often did, and sometimes, still sometimes do, downplayed how ill I actually was. Once home, I collapsed. Perhaps a night at home in my own bed would be enough to revive me, I thought. I slept deeply for a few hours, then restlessly, then not at all. I had a pain in my right side, just below my rib cage, and was having trouble breathing. When I stood, I felt dizzy. I wandered the house delirious as my then girlfriend slept. And yet, now that I was back home, despite my experience on the plane, despite what I was feeling, I tried to tell myself it was nothing to worry about. It was as if I could stop myself from being ill just by force of will, by convincing myself I wasn't ill. When I had been a Mormon missionary decades before, I'd bought a punk cassette, which I no longer have, and the name of which I no longer remember, at a flea market in Marseille. We were forbidden to listen to anything but hymns as missionaries, but that rule, like so many others, I didn't keep. It included a sung parody of a diagnostic right for help, with someone screaming, "I have been ill, I must get better," over and over again. Early on the morning of July 3rd, I was thinking about this song, repeating it obsessively over and over again in my head as I waited for the sun to rise. It was Sunday. I did not feel human. The parousia had returned, and it felt like several people were standing just outside my field of vision, mumbling something that, I began to feel, was about me. Every once in a while, a voice would rise up out of the mumbling, its tones clearer and pitch higher, but still not legible. I could recognize it as an individual voice, but could not recognize what it was saying. "You're going mad," I told myself, but another part of me knew I was not going mad, that I was ill, that I had experienced this before, and that once I was better, the parousia would end. It was that as much as anything that got me to go to the doctor, an eagerness to end the auditory hallucinations. I walked down the hill to the end of our street and went right a half block to the clinic located there. And then, since I hadn't realized the clinic opened an hour later on Sundays and couldn't face the thought of having to walk back up the hill only to walk back down again in an hour, found a place to sit and wait until it did open. When it did, I went in, waited, signed various forms, waited some more, met with the physician's assistant, explained what was happening, had x-rays taken, had my blood drawn. I had a fever. There was nothing to be seen on the x-rays. The PA suggested I go home and rest and drink lots of fluid. He told me they'd call the next day with the results of the blood tests. Or, well, he said, not tomorrow since tomorrow's 4th of July. We'll have results back from the lab on Tuesday. Okay, I said, and stumbled home. I tried to sleep. My head felt very hot. The voices were still there. I felt vaguely nauseous and couldn't stop sweating. I was hardly coherent, but could fake coherency for brief moments. Maybe I'll feel better tomorrow, I told myself. My then girlfriend had been invited to a 4th of July party, I no longer remember where, with people who were more her friends than mine. I was invited as well, but I didn't feel up to going. But was it okay if she went? She wanted to know. I didn't see much point in her staying, and she was clearly eager to go, so I said yes, even encouraged her. An hour later, I started vomiting. On one level, I felt as sick as I've ever felt. On another level, I was so sick, so incoherent, so receded from the surface of my body that it was as if this was happening to someone else. I did not call my girlfriend, though in retrospect, it seems that would have been the best thing to do. At least I don't think I called her. If I did, she didn't answer. Instead, I lay there in the bathroom, vomiting, shivering with a soaring fever. Sometimes I would manage to make it back to the bed for a few minutes, sometimes not. When she came home, I told her I needed to go to the emergency room. Or maybe she was the one who made that decision. My memory of it, the way I tell the story to myself now that we are broken up and haven't spoken in several years, is that it was the first thing I said to her when she walked through the door. At the emergency room, things sped up in some ways, slowed down in others. If you are not in danger of bleeding out or flatlining, a good part of your time in an emergency room involves waiting in a curtained-off semi-room as things happen around you. The pain in my side was fairly intense now. I was given some sort of painkiller. I no longer remember what. I was given an ultrasound, but at some point was taken away for a CT scan as well. My heart was now beating much faster than it normally did, laboring, and it would not slow down. I would be eventually told, a serious infection that had led to a collapsed lung. I had had my appendix out at the same hospital 8 months earlier, and the doctor's best guess was that a small fragment of infected appendiceal tissue, had not been removed from my body. It had floated through my tissues for months before finally attaching to the top of my liver, where it had formed an abscess, which had led to a fistula forming in my thoracic cavity and the cavity filling with fluid, which in turn had collapsed the lung. Early Tuesday morning, they sent me off to have the fluid drained. A man with a thick Rhode Island accent and what, because of some cartoon I watched as a kid, I think of as a sanitation worker's mustache, pushed a needle deep into my back. The needle was connected by a tube to a large jar, which rapidly began filling with pus-like fluid. He filled 2 jars. I felt better momentarily until abruptly I didn't again. Soon I had trouble breathing. By 10 a.m. Tuesday morning, they determined that the cavity had filled with fluid again. They sent me off to have a CT scan so that they could better determine what was happening and how to treat it, telling my then girlfriend I would be away for 15 or 20 minutes. My last memory was of lying on a board as a nurse and a technician tried to position my last memory was of lying on a board as a nurse and a technician tried to position me for the scan. A board? Could it really have been a board? I started shaking and couldn't stop, and then I became unresponsive and blacked out. And if you want to see if I survived, you'll have to read the book.
Thank you so much, Brian. I am a big fan of that book, so it's so nice to hear you read from it. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of my book, my memoir, The Heart and Other Monsters, and then I might read a short chapter from later on. So, this is what I know. There are many ways into this story. The girl, the dog, the boys, the drugs, the gun, the man, my heart. I told my sister once that if she died, she would ruin my life. We were sitting on my couch facing each other. She was going through withdrawal, and I was trying to talk her into sobriety by any means I could think of. I know, Sarah said. When I was little, I thought I had 2 hearts, a healthy, shiny, blood-filled, glorious beast, and a gnarled one that hid behind it. The second heart fed on the first, taking blood and oxygen in large, greedy gulps, but somehow never lost its withered shape. I thought the second heart was where all my bad thoughts lived. This is her home now. This is what I know. My sister died on November 19th, 2013. She died of an overdose in her bathroom. She was dead for 4 days before her body was found. Her dog spent those 4 days trying to claw and bite his way through the bathroom door. Sarah's boyfriend, Jack, found her. I have never been able to ask him what her body looked like. The police thought she had accidentally OD'd and she was cremated within another few days. This is what I know. Some months after she died, I saw a rumor online that Sarah had been friends with people who had committed terrible crimes. I learned of a gun that was sold to intimidate but instead killed, of a body that was cut into pieces, of a man who was with her the morning she died. I filled up a legal pad with notes about my sister's unknown life. I have gone to great lengths to resurrect her. I have read her diaries, attempted to hack into her email, collected newspaper clippings, studied articles and records, sifted through our family history. I have examined each memory and replayed every shared moment, but I cannot summon a story that doesn't end with her death. The night we heard she died, my stepmother, Sharon, took my hand and told me, "It's all on you now." Her own sister, Janet, after years of failed suicide attempts, had killed herself by jumping off the Bay Bridge when Sharon was just 28 years old. Their mother began showing signs of early onset Alzheimer's within months of Janet's death. Sharon turned into her family's caretaker the second Janet stepped off the bridge and into the welcoming water. I put my hands on my stepmother's chest and told her she had to agree not to kill herself in response to Sarah's death. 2 hours later, I would grab my mother's arm and make her promise the same thing. One day, my heart will stop thumping and blood will stop circulating through my body. I will watch everyone's hearts run around this lovely dim world. They glow from space. I will watch those bright twinkling specks that stars gaze at. I will hear those hearts singing. They only know one refrain. It repeats through the universe as their valves open and close. Love is not enough. Love is not enough. If only my heart were a time machine, I would go back to that day on the couch with her. I would say, if you die, it will ruin both our lives. I will look for your body at every turn. I will spend my life with your ghost running right behind me. I will spend my days imagining the lives we could have had. I will live in the ruins of your absence. I will nightmare you alive in my sleep. I will wake up and tell myself, don't let this death become what your days are made of. Let it flicker on the horizon. Give it a home only on the edges of your life. But some part of my brain will always be calling your name. If you die, Sarah, the universe will never be the same. And then I'm going to read a short chapter called The Messenger about driving to my mother's house to tell her my sister had passed away. It takes over an hour to get to my mother's house. My partner is driving, even though I get car sick when I am a passenger. I cannot remember how to steer or shift gears. My dog, Charlotte, sits between us. The dark trees and mountain roads that I normally find soothing have turned against me. I have spent my life wanting my mother to be unequivocally proud of me. I have failed her. Now I am the messenger that will shatter her being. I will be the unholy thing that snuffs out the divine light that was my sister. My mother will be left to face a darkness that I cannot begin to understand. Sarah is dead, and I am the daughter that remains, guilty of still breathing. The truck makes a sharp turn, and I try to fight off the nausea that has moved out of my stomach and into my throat. I cannot tell if it is drizzling or a fog has crept in. Things don't look like they are supposed to. This is a copy of a world that existed just moments ago. Take me back to the before. I will give you anything I have, all my gold and gift and words. I will erase every future page to return to my old life. There is an alternate universe where I am the protector. I hold the head of the slayed beast high, and my family cheers, for I have saved them all. This is not that place. This is the place of ruin and stories that will end with, and then she died. What good am I? I cannot even build a time machine. I should have studied science. I should have been a great many things. Now I am a sister without a sister, a daughter with a terrible task. We are close. I look at my hands and they appear monstrous. I wonder if anyone else will be able to see what I have become. The truck turns down the gravel driveway. I can see headlights on at the end of the road. My mother is in her car, about to leave to see friends or buy milk or watch a movie. She is about to do anything but hear the news I have to tell her. I get out of the truck. She leaves the headlights on and opens the door. I go through the gate. I hear her before I see her. Rose, she says. Yes, it's me. What's wrong? What happened? I don't respond or move forward, and I can feel her worry grow. Is it Charlotte? Did she die? I look back at my sweet dog who is still in the truck, her small face visible even through the light rain. No, it's not Charlotte. I walk to my mother. I look at her and wish I could make the next moment stretch infinitely. Stand here forever until the sun is burnt out and other galaxies have formed and the death of one girl will be inconsequential because we will all have perished. What is it? She asks. Mom, I say. It's Sarah. She's dead. And in 5 words, I undo a life. And that's it.
Thanks so much, Rose. It's great to hear you read from it. I mean, obviously this is something you worked on for a long time. And maybe just before we get started, can you talk just for people who don't know it a little bit about the book and how you would describe it? I know it's described in a particular way on the cover, and there's ways I would describe it, but I just would love to hear how you talk about it.
Sure. So from my reading, you can tell my sister died almost 7 years ago. And we found out a few months after she died that she may have been killed. And so this really became a love letter to her life and an investigation of her death. And then I have also sort of woven in my thoughts on the opioid crisis and rehab centers, which have a lot of problems. And this is, for those that don't know, was my thesis when I was at Cal Arts, and Brian was my mentor. So he's seen me through many iterations of this book and seen me cry about it a few times when I didn't feel like it was going well. But yeah, to me, it's a memoir about grief and addiction and love, and also investigation and what that means when you're grieving.
Yeah, I love how when you said a love letter to my sister and an investigation of her death, I think that kind of covers the poles of the book in a really interesting way. Yeah, and for me, I mean, it's a really powerful, moving, often painful book. I mean, obviously you can tell from the passage you read that there's a lot that's hard about it. But one of the things I love about it, and that I love about good memoir in general, is that it really feels very honest and open, even about things that are painful. But at the same time feels very crafted and well written. You know, it's very lyrical. It's beautifully written. I really love kind of where you got with it, and I think every draft it's gotten better and better. How do you achieve that balance between telling the truth and telling it prettily, if that makes any sense?
I think for me personally, I do that with short, punchy chapters. So I think that I get bogged down in sentimentality when I let myself go on too long. And so for me, it's like finding just the right few sentences that really sum up a feeling. And I don't ever want to linger there too long, which is probably more representative of me as a person than me as a writer. But I think that I also feel like I played a lot with structure in this book to kind of like work against maybe the more traditional grief memoir. Like you find out right away my sister died, and you read a scene in which you experience her death with her. And so I think I sort of like was able to get away with some sort of playful lyrical moments. I don't know if playful is the right word, but non-traditional lyrical moments, because I strayed away from the typical structure of a memoir.
Yeah,
I think that's the answer.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, was there ever a moment where you found either the style taking over, or where you felt that style would get in the way of what needed to be said? Are there moments that you had to really work through?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when you're writing in a genre that already has so many established voices, like The Year of Magical Thinking, or like other grief memoirs that really dominate, or addiction memoirs, that there is a tendency to both be pulled towards writing like that person and to not write like that person. And that can be difficult to navigate. I mean, I naturally write short chapters. I always thought I wasn't a real writer because I didn't want to write long descriptive passages, and thankfully I dropped that. I think one of the things that helped is I didn't write it in order. I had a sort of an idea of the things I wanted to cover, and then as I wrote, I would sort of let the scene speak for itself. And that required a fair amount of editing later, but I think it allowed me to lean into the lyrical voice in the moment and just sort of let each scene have its own feeling. But as you know, since you were my mentor, there was certainly times where I struggled with this. And yeah, I was in Powell's in Portland, crying midway through my second year and staring at the books on how to write, and brought like 7 home with me, convinced that it would show me the way. And there was one sentence out of all those books that said, lean into the hardest part. And I sat down in like 2 days, wrote all 4 versions of how she died. And that really unlocked structure and allowed me to really tap into the voice that I wanted. So that was sort of my way out of feeling stuck.
Yeah. I mean, that is for me one of the really interesting things about the book, the way that formally it's these short sections that kind of accumulate, and that you can't always see where you're going, if that makes sense, if you're reading it. And so,
or writing it.
Right. But I wonder, did that make it easier to write it initially, when you could just say, oh, I'm going to just write about this, and I'm going to write about this, and then you suddenly reach a point where, oh no, I've got to write about this thing that I've been avoiding writing about?
Absolutely.
Did that make it harder eventually?
Yeah, I think initially, I picked the fun scenes or childhood scenes or stuff I had already, written a little bit about, like having cancer when I was younger. Some of that material dates back to when I was at Sarah Lawrence. And then, of course, as I sort of reached the heart of the book is when I completely froze because I had avoided the most tender spots. And so when I really let myself just like lean into that, I spent like 2 days researching like what a person goes through when they have a meth overdose. And I thankfully have a really supportive spouse who came and gave me hugs a lot. Once I sort of like faced that, it became so much easier. I was like, oh, well, after this, everything else seems so much easier to write about. I pushed through that resistance, and then a lot of the narrative opened up for me.
Yeah. And I think, so for me, one of the really interesting things about reading the book is it's a very intimate book. I mean, when you read it, I mean, it may sound a little strange, but there feels like, to me, like there's a great deal of generosity and intimacy and being open to sharing such difficult moments that are connected to your life and your family and your sister. And I think for me, one of the real strengths of the book is, on the one hand, because of how you write about her, we develop a great deal of empathy for Sarah, even while recognizing that she is a complicated person.
Yes, she was.
And on the other hand, I mean, I think we really began to feel that we know and understand and empathize with you, because it's all being filtered through where you are and your perspective on it and things like that. And so you come away from the book kind of feeling like maybe we know you better than we actually do.
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, I mean, I think like anytime you narrativize a real story, it's always the version you want the person on the other end to be reading or seeing. So I think it's both incredibly intimate, and also that, of course, I did a lot of withholding, both for my own privacy and for other people's privacy, because there's rarely an addict or grief story that doesn't involve other people. Sort of my rule of thumb was, if I was willing to talk about Sarah's sex life or Sarah's drug use or Sarah's stealing, I had to be willing to talk about my own, that it didn't seem fair to like reveal all these private things about her without doing the same for myself. So that was sort of my like moral compass in revealing things, was like, okay, well, if I talk about her losing her virginity, I'm going to talk about me, or I'm going to, reveal the terrible things I did while I was using, because I talk about the terrible things she did while she was using. And so it probably forced my hand a little bit more than I maybe would have initially liked. Sort of like, being like, okay, here's a point where I need to be vulnerable. But yeah, I think that people can read this book and know me in a very particular way. But I also feel like the things that don't make it into the book are like my weird sense of humor, my dark humor. Like there's aspects of my personality that maybe people won't understand just reading the book. Because it's not the right place for it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, that's true. So you end up getting a very selective picture in some ways. So we know, for instance, that you are a good liar, which comes up in the book.
Yes.
And but we don't know about your sense of humor, or at least not that much about it and things like that. I
Yeah.
do agree. And that's the funny thing about a memoir is it's like almost like a curation of a life, you know,
Which
and
is its own kind of lie, right?
right,
Like,
right,
or like a lie by omission because you're not including everything.
right, right,
I mean, the Bloomsbury lawyer will hate me for saying that, but you know,
right.
I think we all lie in our memoir writing because we're choosing what we're putting down, and what
Well,
we're
yeah,
putting down may be truth, but like what we're leaving out is also truth.
right, yeah, yeah. It's definitely complicated, I think. I'm curious. I mean, you mentioned leaving things out. Are there things that you left out that you felt that you really wanted to include in retrospect, or do you feel like you kind of you left them out for a reason?
Well, I certainly left out more about the other crimes that are in the book, and some of that was legal reasons.
Yeah,
I had to sort of make adjustments in order to protect privacy and for myself and Bloomsbury not to get sued. Um, and there's definitely certain characters, aka real people, that I chose not to write as much about because they weren't comfortable with it. But I think the heart of the story was exactly what I wanted. So I don't
mm-hmm.
feel like I missed anything that like I'm like, oh, I can't believe I didn't include that. Of course, now that you've said this, I'm gonna go back and think, what did I leave
No, no,
out?
no. I really don't think you did. I just was curious if, I mean, because it
Yeah.
is, once a book is published and is outside of your mind, it kind of has a life of its own, and you suddenly have a different relationship to it in some
Oh,
ways.
sometimes on the sentence level, like I'll read something and I'll change it as I'm reading it
Mm,
out loud because I think that could be better than what
yeah.
this is. But I guess that's just writers.
Yeah, it's that's yeah, writerly impulse, I think.
Yes.
So I do want to go back to, I mean, this is a project that, you know, has been in the works for a while for you. Your sister died now 9 years ago, is that right,
7 years. It'll be
7
seven
years
years
ago.
in November. Yeah.
Right. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And so how did you know it was time to write it? How did you know you were ready to write it? I mean, I think I'm asking that partly because I know that a lot of people who are in the audience are writers or aspiring writers.
Yeah. I think um, I got to the point, I had written a couple like journal type entries after her death. And a few years later, I was teaching in Northern California and was feeling pretty unfulfilled. And I realized that I actually had dinner with another mentor, Mary Morris, in San Francisco. I had gone to see her do a reading, and she was like, "Why aren't you writing? What are you doing?" And I was like, "That's an excellent question, Mary." And after that conversation, it really kind of haunted me that, you know, I was in my 30s. I had experienced this thing. There was a story that like I knew if I was going to be a writer, it had to be the first story I wrote. And I finally just decided that that was worth taking time off from my real life of teaching and going to school. So I applied to grad schools with like the direct intention of going to write this book. I was like, I'm going to take 2 years. I'm going to take out student loans and I'm going to do this for me. And there was certainly a sense of like, you know, when someone close to you dies and there's all these things they didn't get to do, you sort of almost feel this responsibility to like live life fully or some cheesy thing like that. And so there was this sense of like, man, like I'm here, I should just go do this. And so it was sort of these outside and inside influences that really pushed me. And I think too that part of me knew my grieving process would be a lot longer and a lot more complicated if I didn't give myself the space and time to write this, because it was just sort of like living like right here. Like it was just, I sort of had to excise this in order to move on with my life. And thankfully, you know, I went to the right program and had a lot of support and a great mentor, and was actually able to write the thing in 2 years, which I was surprised by. And yeah, so that was, it just sort of felt time.
Yeah, I mean, you've done, I think, a lot of preparation before you got there and thought about
Yeah.
it, And so you came in really ready to write. I will quibble with you about whether teaching is real life or not, as someone who's a teacher, but
No, I think it was sort of just like I was teaching high school students, which was great,
yeah.
but it was also like not what I absolutely wanted to be doing. But there
Mhm.
was a sense of like, this is a stable job, I should just stay here. And instead I'm like, I'm gonna take out loans and go write a book,
Mhm.
which sounds crazy to a lot of people that aren't writers, but sounded increasingly less crazy to me. So I went and
Mhm.
did it.
Yeah, that's good. When you set out to write this, when you had the idea to do this, you probably had an idea of what the book would be or what it would do. Um, can you talk a little bit about how that changed as you wrote it? Is that too huge of a question?
No, not at all. I mean, I think initially when I first arrived at CalArts, it was very much an addiction grief memoir. I was like, I'm going to write about how much I love my sister. And then I realized that there was sort of this micro story of my relationship with her. And then there was all these things that it touched on, like the opioid crisis, or, there's a set of other murders that happen that Sarah's really like the footnote to. For most people, the story would be these other murders that happened, and Sarah probably would hardly be mentioned. And so I realized that story needed to be woven in, that they needed to be footnoted in her story. So while I was at CalArts, I ordered like thousands of pages of court documents and court transcripts,
I
and
remember.
sort of did this like deep, like literal investigation and sending Facebook messages to people I didn't know in the area that she died. And so that all really came out of CalArts. It was really, CalArts is a non-genre program, and I took, speculative fiction, and I wrote weird poetry, and it really allowed me to see that there was like many different kinds of prose I could weave together to make the book, and I think it's much better for it. I also didn't think I would write the speculative chapters, which are like these imagined chapters of things I have no idea how exactly they happened, and I think being in a non-genre program kind of gave me the chutzpah to go out and write imagined scenes into a
Yeah,
memoir.
yeah. Well, I mean, and that I think one of the real strengths of the book is that you do touch on so much, and it's not, I think so often when you have a memoir, people really focus in on the one thing, and
Yeah,
define it, and this is the genre I'm in, and that's what I'm doing, and your your book is so much about how everything is interconnected. So
yeah,
there's drinking and addiction and sex and cancer and the death of Sarah, which is either accidental or murder, family damage and complexities, and all those things kind of go towards creating a total picture, I guess, in some ways.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
That like weaving together of different narratives and different kinds of narratives,
yeah,
while tricky, I think did justice to the story,
yeah,
or served
yeah.
the story well. Yeah,
Yeah, it's a kind of very delicate structure, but it holds together, and I think it allows things to happen that would maybe not happen if it was a more you know precisely directed book, if that makes any sense.
absolutely. At a
Yeah.
certain point, I decided to include newspaper articles about this other crime that had happened, and that was a real shift for me in the structure, to sort of start laying the groundwork of this other story, so the reader
Hmm.
doesn't initially know what they're about or how
Right.
they're connected to Sarah. But yeah, I found every time I sort of added another thread in, it just made it stronger for the
Hmm.
most part.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, so a big part of the book is obviously, as you've been saying, about your sister's death and not knowing whether it was an accident or if it was murder, and having suspicions in various ways, and trying to sort through the circumstances of that, sorting through all the court documents, trying to understand it. And at one point in one of the chapters, you talk about the process of writing the book as being something like writing around the edges of her ghost, I think is what you say.
yeah,
Um, and that is so intriguing to me, this idea that um, you can kind of get the shape in place, but you can never quite have what's absent or what's missing there. Um, And, I think as you go through the book, you start to realize you can speculate on what happened. You have different possibilities. I think as readers reading through, you kind of make a guess on what's the most likely possibility. Um, but um, I know you'll never know for sure, but you feel like just having worked through all that gives you a kind of different relationship to her death, or gives you at least a measure of peace.
Yeah, I do. I think the act of writing it was pretty torturous, and I mean that on an emotional level. I'm not sure I'd like recommend it for everyone who's grieving to like go and look up how people died and read coroner's reports. But I feel like in order for me to move forward, I had to feel like I had explored every memory and every little bit of our lives. I read like 300 letters that she had sent to her childhood best friend over the course of like 20 years. I read diaries, and it was like, that was my obsessiveness around her life and her death, and feeling like I failed her in some way because I didn't understand her when she was alive. And it sort of just allowed me to, one, feel like I had some control over the situation that I had no control over, and two, to kind of say all the things that I always wanted to say to her and didn't, which really comes down to, right, I love you and I wish you were still here. And sort of like through the obsessive telling and retelling and unearthing, I left feeling like a weight had been lifted, and I didn't have to obsess in the same way anymore. Like I had put years of my life into this project and into her, into understanding her and her life and her death. And it felt okay to move, I don't know, forward is the right word, because grief will just come out of nowhere, and it's always a bit of a like jumping into a cold body of water. But
You're
I
thinking
don't feel
about
like
cold bodies of water because of how
yes,
hot it's been in Los Angeles.
It's so hot here. And now I feel like I can tell other stories. And so that in and of itself has been a great relief to sort of like finally get this out of my system, and now I can focus on other things.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's actually something you and I have in common as writers, is that we have a willingness to want to face the thing that's difficult, and, approaching it in very different ways for fiction or nonfiction. But I do think that, that can be a way of kind of coping with difficulty, is just to examine it and understand what it is, or what, to the degree that you can. So
yeah, and therapy. Those
therapy as well. Yes, I also am familiar with this thing called therapy.
Therapy is also good.
So I know, because we've talked about it over the years, and because I'm someone who does this too, that you've read and watched a lot of true crime.
Yes, I have.
Revisiting the book this time, I found myself thinking about that, partly because, I mean, there are true crime elements, but it doesn't seem voyeuristic in the way that at least some true crime does. Did you find yourself thinking much about true crime and what worked for you and what didn't work for you about it when you were writing the book?
Absolutely. I mean, true crime is such a tricky genre, right? Like I love true crime, but I'm also typically like hyper aware of like how invasive it can be for the people they're talking about. It's like typically women that have been murdered or raped in some terrible way. And yet I sort of had to acknowledge that like there was clearly some part of me that like was attracted to the horror of true crime. And I always thought if something really bad happened to me or someone I loved, then I would never want to watch or see it again. And the reverse was kind of true. I found myself really getting pulled into it, really anything. And I think that there's some comfort in someone taking control of a horror story, a live horror story, and narrativizing it like that. There's something satisfying about that, and comforting in a very twisted way, I think. Yeah, so I thought a lot about the true crime part, and I thought a lot about the other people that had been killed by these men that Sarah was associated with. And sort of where I ended up is I didn't feel like I needed or could do a deep dive into that crime properly, because I wasn't interviewing all those people's relatives. The story was really about Sarah. So my goal was to show that case and those set of murders only as it related back to Sarah, because I felt like that was the only place I could sort of like rightfully account these other things that had happened. But it's hard because I think part of I love a good mystery too. It's like that part of me that really wants to know who did it and really wants to know all the weird details, and the kind of, you know, the part of me that likes reading your books, the horror part. And so I battled with how much true crime to put in the book or how much to lean into it. And I think I found a happy medium at the end. But yeah, it was a question I asked myself a lot. Like, do we need to do another, you know, look at some terrible murderer? And so I tried to keep it more focused on, I guess, the victim in this case, or Sarah, and less on like obsessing about who the men were or why they did what they did. Sort of
I mean,
compromise.
I mean, I do think the focus ends up being both on you and Sarah, rather than on the person or the people who might potentially have killed her. And you know, I do understand. Yeah, it's a tricky thing. It'd be so great if you had a definitive solution.
It would be wonderful.
But of course, so rarely in life do we actually have things like that. So we are getting to the point where we're, if you guys have any questions, we're happy to answer them. There's a little Q&A button on the bottom of the Zoom. So if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A, and we'll answer it. I'll ask one or two more questions, and we'll kind of, you know, but we'd be more than happy if you had questions. Maybe this is a simple question, but can you just talk a little bit about the title? You touched on it a little bit in the first excerpt, but why did you choose the Heart and Other Monsters as the title for this?
Well, the short answer is my thesis was due the next day, and I had to come up with a title. I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but I literally just started jotting down different words or feelings or things that I felt like were associated with the book. And I had sort of this big list of like, you know, grief, addiction, blood, heart. And then it sort of just like kind of emerged, like one of those 3D pictures that you look at kind of cross-eyed, and then the picture emerges. I was like, oh, there's the title. And it just kind of came out. Josh was with me my husband, when I was doing it. And once I said it out loud, I was like, oh, this is the title. And thankfully, my editor liked it too, so I got to keep it. But it just, I literally just sort of made a list of did like a word jumble, and then picked it out of there, which is probably not the most crafty answer, but
well, I think it works as a title. I mean, I think it's a good title, but I was curious about it. And if heart comes up a lot in the book, and monstrous behavior obviously comes up sometimes too.
And I like the idea. I mean, part of what I hope I get through in the book is that like loving someone is kind of monstrous. Like there's a horror to it, because the deeper you love, the more hurt you can be, the more loss you experience. So this idea that the heart is also a monster felt appropriate given the book.
Yeah, I think for me, the book is also about, you know, how you live through damage, and how some people manage to live through it and some people don't, even if they're in the same family or going through similar circumstances. And that's interesting. Just the complexities of that, which is something that I think we kind of know, but you know, we rarely, I don't know. I mean, it's hard. We often think, you know, people should just be able to live through things, and everybody's different, and you know, you have to figure it out.
A sense when trauma stops being trauma and you're just okay, which I really wanted to fight against. There's so many grief or addiction memoirs are like, and then I was okay. And I'm like, well, I'm not okay. Like, I think it's okay to not be okay. I think it's okay to feel the depths of trauma and have a good life. That a lot of people who've experienced trauma and lived through it have to live with that all the time, these sort of seemingly contradictory feelings. And that's all right. That doesn't make you crazy or weird or unable to move on. That part of living with trauma is living with trauma.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I
Yeah.
think a lot of, most of the characters, well, people who are characters
Yes.
in this, are complicated, and that for me, I think, is also interesting. That it's like, it's not that there's good and bad people; it's that there's these really complicated people who, you know, there's one person who is politically very involved and very active, has his heart in the right place,
Yep.
but is kind of monstrous, kind of on a personal level, and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. And it is this sense of you know, people with their different sides and their, you know, how do you kind of go through that? It's
Well,
complicated.
and Rick, who you mentioned, is like, he had his own set of trauma that led him to be an abusive alcoholic. And like, I
Yeah,
think it is important to sort of acknowledge that, like, you know, I think
yeah,
he came by that honestly, even though he didn't maybe do the work as an adult that he should. So he didn't pass that on.
yeah,
But yeah.
yeah. So there's a question in the
Okay.
Q&A, which is from Bruno. You talked a little about this freeing you to tell other stories. Do you think they'll be autobiographical, openly autobiographical? Also, Bruno was curious, did justice come up as one of those words, title words your book was about, or is that the very last thing it's about, since it's about bringing miscreants to justice? Is you're writing about your sister, since it's not about bringing miscreants to justice,
Yeah.
Bruno corrects below, is it writing about your sister doing her justice?
Yeah, justice is a weird word. I like don't believe in the death penalty either. I mean, I would love for this person who I think was involved, may have been involved with their death, to not be walking around in the world, and he is. But yeah, justice wasn't really a part of it. Justice, I think, is, well, we live in America, so justice is a tricky thing. Yeah, and then, sorry, what was the first part of the question?
The first is
Oh, the
yeah.
autobiographical.
Mm-hmm.
I'm currently working on a novel about a therapist that doesn't feel empathy. So it's obviously autobiographical. No, I mean, it's ironic because I'm actually in school studying to be a therapist, but it is not autobiographical. I am taking a little bit of time off from the memoir world and sort of living in this world of social sociopaths and a murder mystery. Although I was talking with my editor about it, and it's funny. It's like still covering a lot of the same questions that I have in the memoir, which is like, what do we inherit from our parents, and what does family trauma do to a child, and how do you live with bad feelings or like thinking bad thoughts? What do you do with all that? But this time I don't have to be my own character. I get to write from the point of view of this totally made up person. So for now, that's the next project. But I imagine that at some point I will return to memoir after some time has passed, and hopefully not because some terrible trauma has happened.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like too that there's certain themes and ideas and ways of thinking about how people operate that are going to continue into fiction as
Absolutely.
well. Yeah. So someone else asked a question. This is from someone whose name is anonymous. What memoirs, other books did you read for inspiration for this? And during your mentorship, what books did Brian recommend? I don't remember what I recommended, but what are some of the books that were important for you as you?
Well, I mean, as cheesy as it sounds, actually, your Raymond Carver book was really helpful because its structure is not typical of memoirs. You actually showed it to me, I think, before it was even officially out in the world.
Yeah,
and that was really helpful to let me break free of sort of what I thought a memoir should look like, and sort of weaving in of other texts and things. It was super helpful. Mean by Miriam Gerba and Excavation by Wendy Ortiz were both incredibly helpful. Jane, a Murder, and The Red Parts by Maggie Nelson. One is like a prose poetry book, and the other one is a memoir about a trial. So taking elements from both of those, inspiration from both of those, and then Lacey Johnson's The Other Side, I believe, which is about her being kidnapped by her former boyfriend. So really just looking, I mean, I guess a lot of it was like women examining trauma and writing through it. And those were all incredibly helpful to me. I'm sure so. Oh, and The Fact of a Body by Alex Marzano-Lesnevich was incredible. That's very much a true crime book mixed with memoir. And it really I felt like it gave me permission to do some like genre bending stuff. And you've read that. It's an
I
incredible
have. Yeah, I think
book.
that's a great
Yeah.
book. Yeah.
I'm not sure what else you recommended to me.
You know, I don't remember. I mean, we talked about Maggie Nelson's work and
Yeah.
various other things along the way. And we, yeah, it's been long enough. It's been 2 or 3 years now. So,
I know.
so yeah.
Maybe another night in bullshit Suck City or.
No, I didn't recommend that.
No. Oh.
but that's that's an interesting one to read.
Yeah.
Someone asks if you have any thoughts about what Sarah would think of the book, and have you had any dreams about her since finishing the book, and whether you've discussed it in your dreams with her.
I think she would like the book. I actually wrote about her a fair amount when she was alive, and I was struggling with being sober and her using, and I would send her those pieces, so she knew and was okay with me writing about her. I also, when she had a year of sobriety, she went and gave a talk to her old high school and gave sort of a testimony of your addiction and your sobriety, and she wanted to talk to young people. And I sort of used that a little bit as a template to what I felt like she would be comfortable with me revealing, sort of like what she wanted other potential addicts to know about her life. So I hope she would like it. I hope she would see it for what it is, and that it's meant to be a loving thing. I dream about her a fair amount. It's often that in the dream, I know she's going to die, but she's alive. And I'm surprised that she's not dead. And then, of course, I wake up and remember that she's actually gone. And so I haven't sort of talked to her in any of my dreams about the book. I did a lot of EMDR after she died. And in those sessions, I would like imagine us speaking about things, and that was helpful, but no direct dreams about the book.
Okay, good. That may be about all I have in terms of questions.
All right.
I'll just say it's a Heart and Other Monsters. It's a really great book. I think a link to the book is in the chat if you're interested. And if you want to buy it from Powerhouse, which I definitely recommend, it's great to support independent bookstores.
Yeah.
And my book, you'll find a link to the chat in the chat too as well. So yeah, but thank you very much, Rose. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Powerhouse.
Yep. Thank you, both of you, Rose and Brian. It was great. I think it was by far our most useful and meaningful event on just the craft of writing. Is awesome. Thank you for everyone who asked questions. If you missed any of the event for any reason, we'll have it on YouTube soon. And yeah, buy the books. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.